They called my wedding a disgrace. Imagine hearing those words from your own parents just days before the happiest moment of your life. My father didn't congratulate me. My mother didn't ask if I was happy. Instead, they told me they would rather stay away than let anyone think our family approved of my marriage. So when I walked down the aisle that afternoon, the seats reserved for my family were completely empty. While my closest friends stood and smiled through tears, the people who had raised me were somewhere else, entirely laughing, aboard a luxury yacht with my younger sister, raising champagne glasses beneath fireworks as if my wedding meant nothing at all. Later, I would see the photos myself. My mother's caption read, "Celebrating life's true milestones." Not a single word about her eldest daughter. For a moment, I thought they had finally broken me. But life has a strange sense of timing. Because while my parents were celebrating my humiliation, television cameras were quietly rolling inside the chapel. As I exchanged vows with the man they had dismissed as unworthy, millions of viewers across the country were about to discover a truth my family had never cared enough to learn. The quiet man standing beside me wasn't an ordinary groom. He was Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire CEO of a technology empire worth more than $5 billion. Within hours, the same parents who had refused to attend my wedding were desperately trying to reach me. Their phones rang nonstop. Friends demanded answers. Reporters surrounded their home. The family name they had spent a lifetime protecting suddenly became the center of every conversation. Then my phone lit up. My father's message appeared first. "Evelyn, where are you? We need to talk." A second later, my mother sent another. "Why didn't you tell us who Daniel really was?" I looked at the screen for a long time, remembering every birthday they forgot, every achievement they ignored, every time they chose my younger sister over me. Then I answered with exactly one thing. Not an argument. Not an explanation. Just a single ha-ha. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making people suffer. It's quietly becoming everything they insisted you could never be, and realizing you no longer need their approval to enjoy the view. After I sent that single haha to my family's frantic messages, I set my phone down and stared out the apartment window for a long time. The city lights shimmered against the evening sky, but my mind had already drifted back to where this story truly began, not with the television cameras or the headlines that stunned the country, but with the quiet walk toward an altar where 3 empty rows said more than words ever could. 3 days earlier, I had still allowed myself one final hope. Hope has a strange way of surviving long after reason tells you it should die. Even after years of disappointment, there is always a small part of a daughter that believes. This time will be different. I convinced myself that when the wedding day finally arrived, my parents would change their minds. They would walk through the church doors at the last minute, embarrassed by their earlier words but unwilling to miss such an important milestone. I wanted to believe that love would outweigh pride. I was wrong. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 32 years old, and I had spent more than a decade building a career as an interior architect in Seattle. My profession wasn't glamorous in the way my family admired. My work rarely appeared on magazine covers, and there were no standing ovations when I completed a project. Instead, I designed places where people could build lives, homes filled with warmth, schools where children could dream, community spaces where strangers became neighbors. I loved creating beauty that lasted longer than applause. The people who knew me through my work often described me as patient, dependable, and quietly determined. They saw someone who listened more than she spoke, someone who believed every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough. What they didn't know was that determination had never been a personality trait. It had been a survival skill. Standing beside me through every difficult season was Daniel Whitmore. If you had met Daniel before that wedding, you never would have guessed the life he truly lived. He wasn't flashy. He never chased attention. He preferred simple navy suits to expensive designer labels, drove ordinary-looking cars, and treated everyone from restaurant servers to construction workers with the same calm respect. More than anything else, Daniel knew how to listen. After long days at work, he would sit beside me on our apartment balcony while I talked about impossible clients, impossible deadlines, or memories I wished I could forget. He never interrupted. He never tried to solve every problem with grand speeches. Sometimes he simply reached for my hand and reminded me that I didn't have to carry every burden alone. That quiet kindness became the safest place I had ever known. On the morning of our wedding, he smiled at me with the same steady warmth he always had. "You ready?" he asked. I laughed softly, though my stomach was tied into impossible knots. "As ready as I'll ever be." He brushed a loose strand of hair away from my face. "No matter what happens today," he said gently, "I'm proud of you." Those words settled somewhere deep inside me because they were something I had spent my entire life longing to hear. The chapel was breathtaking without feeling extravagant. Soft candlelight flickered along the walls, filling the sanctuary with a golden glow that made the white roses lining the aisle seem almost luminous. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering gentle shades of blue and crimson across the polished floor. Friends moved quietly through the pews, speaking in hushed voices, as musicians rehearsed the final notes before the ceremony. Everything looked exactly as I had imagined it when I was a little girl. Everything, except one thing. Near the front of the sanctuary stood 3 rows reserved for my family. Each seat carried a carefully printed name card. Robert Carter, Margaret Carter, Sophia Carter, along with places for aunts, uncles, cousins, and relatives who had watched me grow up. Every seat remained empty. The untouched chairs seemed louder than the music filling the church. Guests tried not to stare, but people noticed absence just as quickly as they noticed celebration. A few friends exchanged sympathetic glances before offering encouraging smiles in my direction. Their kindness meant more than they probably realized, but it couldn't erase the ache settling inside my chest. I looked toward the entrance one more time. Maybe traffic had delayed them. Maybe my father would appear first, pretending nothing had happened. Maybe my mother would hurry inside, apologizing for making me worry. Maybe Sophia would smile and say she had been teasing me all along. The heavy wooden doors never opened. Instead, another memory pushed its way into my thoughts. It had been only a few days before the wedding when my father's name appeared on my phone. Seeing it surprised me. Robert Carter rarely called unless he wanted something. I answered almost immediately. "Hi, Dad." There was no greeting in return. No question about how I was feeling. No curiosity about the final wedding preparations. His voice was cold, controlled, and painfully familiar. "This wedding is a disgrace to our family." For a moment, I honestly believed I had misunderstood him. "What?" "You heard me," he replied. "People are already talking. They don't understand why you're rushing into this. They don't understand why we would support something beneath our family's standards." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Dad, I'm marrying someone I love. This isn't about love." He spoke those words with absolute certainty. "It's about reputation." I tried to explain that Daniel was a good man. Honest, kind, hardworking. The kind of person anyone would be proud to welcome into their family. My father never let me finish. "We won't be attending." The words landed with the finality of a courtroom verdict. Before I could respond, I heard my mother in the background asking for the phone. When Margaret spoke, her voice sounded softer than my father's, but somehow it hurt even more. "Your father only wants what's best for you." I closed my eyes. "Mom, please." She sighed. "A wedding represents an entire family, Evelyn. We can't pretend to celebrate something we don't believe is right." Not once did she ask whether I was happy. Not once did she ask whether Daniel treated me well. The conversation ended exactly as it had begun, with concern for appearances and none for the daughter they were about to abandon. I sat in silence after the call ended, staring at the blank screen in my hand. I told myself it would still be all right. I told myself they were angry now, but time would soften them. Then my phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Sophia. There was only one sentence. "You don't deserve a grand wedding." I read those 7 words over and over, hoping I would discover some hidden joke, some sign that she didn't truly mean them. There wasn't one. The message was exactly as cruel as it appeared. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Now, standing just outside the chapel doors with my bouquet trembling slightly in my hands. Those words echoed through my mind, louder than the organ playing inside. A wedding is supposed to begin with excitement. Mine began with grief. The coordinator approached quietly and smiled, with gentle reassurance. "They're ready whenever you are." I nodded. My legs felt heavier than they ever had before. For one last time, I looked toward the church entrance. It remained empty. A strange calm settled over me. Perhaps this was the moment every child eventually faces, the moment you stop waiting for someone to become the person you've always needed them to be. I drew one slow breath, then another. I straightened my shoulders, tightened my fingers around the bouquet, and lifted my chin. If my family had chosen not to witness this chapter of my life, I would not allow their absence to become its ending. I whispered the words only I could hear. "If I have to walk down that aisle alone today, then I'll walk it alone." And with that, the chapel doors began to open. The doors slowly swung open, and the first notes of the processional filled the chapel. I tightened my grip on the bouquet, willing my hands to stop trembling. Every instinct told me to look forward, to focus on the altar where Daniel was waiting, but my eyes drifted once more toward the rows reserved for my family. They were still empty. In that moment, I finally stopped expecting them to arrive. It hurt more than I can describe, but it also forced me to confront a truth I had spent most of my life avoiding. My parents weren't missing my wedding because of bad weather, a delayed flight, or an emergency. They were missing it because they had made a choice. Just as they had made so many choices before, they had chosen someone else over me. As I stood frozen at the entrance of the chapel, memories I had buried years earlier began surfacing one after another. I was 8 years old, the first time I truly realized my younger sister and I lived in different worlds under the same roof. Sophia's birthday had transformed our home into something that looked like a scene from a magazine. Colorful balloons covered every corner of the living room. Fresh flowers decorated the dining table. Friends, neighbors, and relatives crowded into the house, carrying expensive gifts wrapped in shiny paper. My mother had spent weeks planning every detail, and my father proudly welcomed every guest as if he were hosting the most important celebration of the year. Sophia stood in the center of it all, wearing a sparkling dress and a paper crown. Every camera pointed toward her. Every smile belonged to her. I remember standing near the staircase, holding a small handmade birthday card I had spent hours drawing the night before. I had folded colored paper into flowers because I knew we couldn't afford anything expensive with my allowance. I thought she might like something made with love. When I walked toward her, hoping to hand her the card before everyone sang happy birthday, my mother gently stopped me. "Not now, Evelyn," she whispered. "You're blocking the photographer." I stepped aside without arguing. I told myself there would be another moment. There never was. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, I found the card still tucked beneath my arm. Sophia had never even seen it. That should have been just one disappointing birthday. Instead, it became the pattern of my childhood. Every year, Sophia's birthdays were celebrated as family events. My parents rented venues, invited dozens of guests, ordered elaborate cakes, and hired photographers to capture every smile. They proudly displayed framed pictures from those parties throughout the house. When my birthdays arrived, things were different. Sometimes my father remembered after dinner. Sometimes my mother apologized for being too busy. Sometimes there was a small cake from the grocery store if time allowed. Other years, there wasn't even that. I learned very early that disappointment became easier to carry if you expected it before it happened. Presents followed the same pattern. Sophia received exactly what she wanted. I usually received things she no longer needed. Books with her name written inside the cover. Sweaters she had outgrown. Art supplies missing half the pieces. Once, when I turned 12, my mother handed me a jewelry box wrapped in old birthday paper. Inside was a silver necklace with a broken clasp. "It still looks beautiful," she said. "Your father can fix it someday." I smiled because that was what I had learned to do. I thanked her because grateful children weren't supposed to complain. Later that night, sitting alone in my bedroom, I realized the necklace had belonged to Sophia years earlier. No one had even removed the tiny initials engraved on the back. That wasn't the part that hurt the most. The part that stayed with me was realizing no one thought I deserved something that belonged only to me. As Sophia grew older, my parents' admiration only deepened. She discovered piano at the age of 6, and from that day forward, music became the center of our household. Every recital mattered. Every competition became a family mission. Our weekends revolved around rehearsals. Vacations were scheduled around concerts. My father proudly introduced her to everyone as our gifted daughter. My mother framed every certificate she earned and displayed them across the living room walls. Visitors couldn't spend 5 minutes inside our house without hearing another story about Sophia's talent. I admired her ability. She truly was gifted. What hurt wasn't her success. It was the comparison that always followed. Whenever I brought home excellent grades, my father barely glanced at the report card before asking how Sophia's piano lessons had gone. If teachers complimented my creativity, my mother smiled politely before reminding everyone that Sophia had just won another competition. No achievement ever seemed allowed to belong entirely to me. Eventually, I stopped bringing home certificates right away. I tucked them into my backpack and waited days before mentioning them. It felt easier that way. One afternoon when I was 17, I spread architectural sketches across the kitchen table. I had entered a regional student design competition and spent weeks creating a concept for a community center that would bring more natural light into shared spaces. I was proud of that project. Sophia walked past, glanced at the drawings, and laughed. "You just draw buildings." She shrugged as though that explained everything. "It's not real art." She disappeared upstairs before I could answer. I looked toward my parents, expecting at least one of them to defend me. My mother simply continued preparing dinner. My father folded his newspaper and said, "Your sister has a point. Music moves people. Buildings are just buildings." I didn't argue. There was no point. Years later, I would design hospitals where frightened families found hope, schools where children discovered their futures, and homes where generations built memories together. But that afternoon, all I heard was my father's voice telling me my dreams mattered less. Looking back now, I don't think my parents realized how many invisible decisions they were making. Every comparison taught me that love had to be earned. Every forgotten celebration taught me not to expect recognition. Every time they praised Sophia while overlooking me, they quietly convinced me that I would always come second. Children don't suddenly stop wanting their parents' approval. They simply become experts at pretending they don't need it. By the time I became an adult, I had mastered that performance. I smiled at family dinners. I congratulated Sophia after every concert. I listened as relatives praised her accomplishments while asking me polite questions they quickly forgot. On the surface, I appeared calm. Inside, a small part of me kept asking the same question. What was so wrong with me? Standing at the entrance of the chapel all those years later, I finally understood the answer. Nothing. There had never been anything wrong with me. I simply wasn't the child my parents had decided to build their dreams around. That realization didn't erase the pain. It didn't make the empty seats hurt less. But it changed something inside me. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself for a love I had spent decades trying to earn. As the music swelled through the sanctuary, I lifted my eyes toward the altar where Daniel stood waiting for me. Unlike every memory behind me, he wasn't looking past me to someone else. He wasn't comparing me to anyone. His entire attention rested on me alone. And somehow, that quiet certainty gave me enough strength to take the first step forward, leaving behind not only the empty chairs, but the little girl who had spent her whole life waiting for someone to choose her. As I took that first step down the aisle, something inside me became unexpectedly clear. The little girl who had spent years wondering why she was never enough was still somewhere within me, but she was no longer the one making decisions. Every step toward Daniel felt like a step away from a lifetime of chasing approval that had never been mine to earn. When I reached the altar, Daniel smiled with the same quiet confidence that had steadied me from the day we met. He didn't ask whether I was all right. He could already see the answer in my eyes. Instead, he gently squeezed my hand, silently reminding me that I wasn't facing this day alone. That simple gesture carried me through the ceremony, but it also reminded me how different Daniel had always been from the people who raised me. We met almost 4 years earlier through a renovation project in downtown Seattle. My architecture firm had been hired to redesign an aging historic building into a mixed-use cultural center. Daniel attended one of the early planning meetings, representing one of the project's private investors. At least, that was how he introduced himself. Nothing about him suggested extraordinary wealth or influence. He arrived on time, listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked every member of the design team before leaving. While many investors focused only on budgets and deadlines, Daniel wanted to know how natural light would affect children's reading spaces, whether elderly visitors could comfortably navigate the entrances, and how local artists might benefit from the finished building. It was the first time I had met someone who seemed to value people as much as numbers. Over the following months, our conversations slowly grew beyond blueprints and construction schedules. We discovered a shared love of quiet bookstores, long walks through Seattle's waterfront, and coffee shops where no one felt rushed to leave. Daniel never tried to impress me with expensive gifts or dramatic gestures. Instead, he remembered the little things. He knew I preferred tea when I was stressed. He remembered the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, even after I had mentioned it only once. When deadlines kept me working late, he appeared outside my office with dinner and insisted we eat together instead of separately. Those moments seemed ordinary at the time. Looking back now, they became the foundation of everything that followed. As our relationship deepened, I gradually shared more about my family. I didn't tell him everything at first. Some disappointments are difficult to explain because you worry they will sound unbelievable to people raised differently. One evening, after we had been dating for nearly a year, he asked a simple question while we watched the sunset from our apartment balcony. "When was the last time your parents visited you?" I opened my mouth to answer before realizing I couldn't remember. Not because it had been months, because it had been years. Daniel didn't criticize them. He didn't tell me I deserved better. He simply listened while I spoke more honestly than I ever had before. For the first time, I admitted how exhausting it was to spend every holiday wondering whether this would finally be the year my family treated me like I belonged. He reached for my hand. "You shouldn't have to convince people to love you," he said quietly. At the time, I wanted to believe him. Part of me still wasn't sure it could be true. My career, however, continued moving forward in ways I had never imagined. After years of long nights and impossible deadlines, I submitted a sustainable housing design to a national architectural competition. The project focused on creating affordable neighborhoods filled with natural light, green spaces, and community gathering areas, rather than simply maximizing profit. Winning never crossed my mind. I entered because I believed the ideas mattered. Several months later, I received the call that changed my professional life. My design had been selected as the national winner. I remember sitting at my desk staring at the email for nearly 5 minutes because I honestly thought someone had sent it by mistake. When reality finally settled in, the first people I wanted to tell were my parents. Old habits die slowly. I mailed them formal invitations to the awards ceremony. I even included handwritten notes explaining how much it would mean to have them there. Weeks passed without a response. Eventually, my mother called. "We won't be able to make it." Her explanation came easily. Sophia had another international piano competition scheduled for the same weekend. "It would be impossible to support both of you," she said. I thanked her for letting me know. After we hung up, I sat alone in my office for several minutes, before folding the invitation they had declined and placing it inside my desk drawer. The night of the ceremony, I searched the audience one final time before my name was announced. Every reserved seat remained empty. When I accepted the award, applause filled the auditorium. Reporters asked questions. Fellow architects congratulated me. Photographers requested interviews. Yet the only faces I kept looking for never appeared. Afterward, Daniel found me standing outside the venue, holding the award in one hand and trying very hard not to cry. Without saying a word, He wrapped his arms around me. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. Those 4 words meant more than every trophy I had ever received. A few months later, one of my completed community projects opened to the public. Families filled the courtyard. Children ran across the playground I had helped design. Elderly couples sat beneath trees that had existed only as sketches on my drafting table a year earlier. Watching people actually use something I had imagined was one of the happiest moments of my career. Again, I invited my parents. Again, they declined. My father later called to ask how much the project had cost. He never asked how many families it would serve. That conversation taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. He measured success differently than I did. He admired status. I admired purpose. Those 2 things rarely pointed in the same direction. Through every disappointment, Daniel remained remarkably consistent. He celebrated every finished project as though it were a personal victory. When clients praised my work, he smiled more proudly than I did. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of every obstacle I had already overcome. Never once did he compare me to anyone else. Eventually, on a cool autumn evening, he asked if I would take a walk with him through the park where we had shared our first date. The trees glowed with shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried that unmistakable crispness that always arrives just before winter. We stopped beside a quiet lake reflecting the evening sky. Daniel took both of my hands. "I've spent a long time thinking about what kind of future I want," he said. "And every version of it has you in it." Then he knelt. The world around us seemed to disappear. I don't remember every word he spoke, because I was already crying before he finished asking. I only remember saying yes, over and over again. Yes, yes, yes. Later that night, I called my parents with genuine excitement, hoping perhaps an engagement might become the beginning of something new between us. Instead, my father asked whether I had considered how the marriage would affect the family's reputation. My mother wondered if I was making the decision too quickly. Neither of them asked whether I loved him. Neither asked whether he loved me. When the call ended, I looked across the room at Daniel, who was making tea in the kitchen, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He caught me watching him and smiled. "What is it?" I walked over and wrapped my arms around him. "Nothing," I said softly. But deep inside, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit before. The family I had spent my life trying to hold together had never truly seen me. The family I was about to build with Daniel already did. By the time our wedding day finally arrived, I wasn't walking toward a perfect future free from pain. I was walking toward the first person who had ever made me feel that being myself was already enough, and that quiet certainty gave me the courage to keep moving forward, no matter who chose not to walk beside me. As I stood across from Daniel, the weight that had pressed against my heart since that morning slowly began to ease. The empty seats behind me still existed. My parents' rejection had not magically disappeared. But in that moment, with Daniel's hands wrapped gently around mine, I realized something important. They had refused to witness this day, yet they could not take it away from me. The officiant smiled warmly before inviting us to begin exchanging our vows. For a brief second, the chapel seemed to disappear. The flowers, the candles, the guests, even the ache I had carried through those heavy wooden doors faded into the background. There was only Daniel. I had written and rewritten my vows countless times over the previous month. Every version sounded either too formal or too emotional. Nothing seemed capable of expressing what this man had quietly become in my life. When I finally began speaking, my voice trembled. "I used to believe love had to be earned," I said, meeting his eyes. "I thought if I worked harder, if I became more successful, if I disappointed fewer people, maybe one day I would finally deserve it." A few guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. "But then I met you." I smiled through the emotion, threatening to break my voice. "You never asked me to become someone else. You never compared me to anyone. You simply chose me every single day." Daniel's expression softened. "And because of you," I continued, "I've learned that love isn't something we compete for. It's something we build together." The silence inside the chapel felt almost sacred. When I finished, Daniel squeezed my hands so gently that I barely felt the movement. Then it was his turn. Unlike me, he didn't unfold a sheet of carefully prepared paper. He simply looked at me. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who admired success," he began calmly. "They admired titles. They admired achievements. They admired influence." He smiled softly. "But very few people ever impressed me." A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the guests. "You did." His eyes never left mine. "You see beauty where others see empty space. You solve problems without asking who will receive the credit. You care about people long after everyone else has moved on." He paused for just a moment. "I don't admire you because of what you've accomplished. I admire you because of who you are when nobody is watching." The tears I had fought so hard to control finally escaped. Daniel reached up and gently brushed one away with his thumb, before continuing. "I promise that no matter what happens in our lives, you'll never have to wonder whether someone chooses you." The words settled somewhere so deep inside me that I knew I would remember them for the rest of my life. For years I had imagined hearing something like that from my parents. Instead, it came from the man standing in front of me. When Daniel finished, the chapel remained silent for several seconds, before quiet applause filled the room. Not loud, not theatrical, just sincere. The officiant waited patiently for the applause to fade before continuing the ceremony. As he spoke, I found myself glancing toward the front pew where my closest friends sat. Emma smiled through tears. Michael gave me a small, encouraging nod. Several colleagues from my architecture firm looked genuinely happy for us. None of them shared my last name, yet every one of them had chosen to be there. For the first time that afternoon, I understood that family and loyalty weren't always the same thing. The officiant asked for the wedding rings. Daniel slipped mine gently onto my finger. The simple platinum band caught the warm afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. It wasn't the size of the diamond that caught my attention. It was the quiet certainty in Daniel's hands. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only complete confidence in the promise we were making. I placed his ring on his finger, with hands that finally felt steady. Then, just as the officiant prepared to pronounce us husband and wife, something unexpected happened. The heavy chapel doors opened. At first, I assumed another guest had arrived late. Several people turned instinctively toward the entrance. Instead of relatives rushing inside, I saw strangers. Men carrying professional video cameras. Women wearing press badges around their necks. Someone adjusted a large broadcast camera near the back of the sanctuary. Another person raised a boom microphone above the aisle. The atmosphere inside the chapel shifted almost immediately. Guests exchanged confused glances. Soft whispers spread across the pews. Even the officiant looked momentarily surprised. I frowned. This wasn't part of the wedding photography. These weren't local freelancers. Their equipment looked far too sophisticated. One cameraman quietly spoke into a headset before positioning himself near the side aisle. A woman carrying a tablet quickly reviewed notes, while another crew member adjusted portable lighting near the entrance. My heart began beating faster. I leaned slightly toward Daniel. "Do you know who they are?" He looked toward the newcomers, without showing the slightest concern. "I do." His calm answer only deepened my confusion. "You do?" He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Before I could ask another question, one of the cameras switched on. A small red recording light appeared. Then another. Within seconds, several lenses were pointed directly toward us. Instinctively, I felt exposed. This was supposed to be one of the most personal moments of my life. Instead, it suddenly felt as though invisible walls had disappeared, and the entire world was being invited inside. I turned toward Daniel again. "What's happening?" For the first time that afternoon, genuine uncertainty crept into my voice. I searched his face for answers. He remained remarkably composed. Not secretive. Not nervous. Simply patient. As though he had been waiting for this exact moment. He gently took both of my hands again. "Evayin." His voice was quiet enough that only I could hear. "You trust me?" The question surprised me. More than once during our relationship, difficult moments had begun with those same words. Every single time, He had given me a reason to answer yes. I do. A faint smile appeared. I know this feels unexpected. It does. I'm sorry I couldn't explain sooner. He paused just long enough for me to see something unusual in his expression. Not guilt. Hope. I wanted today to belong to you. It already does. He slowly shook his head. No. It belongs to the woman you've spent your whole life becoming. I frowned, trying to understand. I don't. You've hidden in other people's shadows long enough. His thumb brushed gently across the back of my hand. You deserve to be seen. The words settled over me with unexpected weight. Not because I fully understood them. I didn't. But because of the sincerity behind them. Daniel had never spoken carelessly. If he believed this mattered, then somehow it did. Even if I couldn't yet see why. Around us, the production crew quietly continued preparing their equipment with remarkable professionalism. Nobody interrupted the ceremony. Nobody shouted instructions. Everything happened with respectful precision, as though they had no intention of stealing the moment, only preserving it. Still, countless questions filled my mind. Why were they here? Who had invited them? How had Daniel arranged this, without ever mentioning it? What could possibly be important enough to bring professional media into a private wedding ceremony? The officiant received a brief nod from someone near the back of the chapel before looking toward us with a reassuring smile. Daniel looked into my eyes one more time. There was absolute certainty in his expression. No fear. No hesitation. Only quiet confidence. I took a slow breath. Nothing about the day had unfolded the way I had expected. Not my family's absence. Not the overwhelming peace I eventually found standing beside Daniel. And certainly not the arrival of television cameras moments before we officially became husband and wife. I had no idea what was about to happen. But somewhere deep inside me, I sensed that this wasn't the end of the story I had expected to tell. It was the beginning of one that none of us could yet imagine. The uncertainty stayed with me as the officiant smiled and invited us to finish the ceremony. The cameras remained respectfully quiet, their operators barely moving, yet I could feel every lens aimed in our direction. Questions crowded my mind, but none of them seemed as important as the promise Daniel and I had come here to make. Whatever explanation he was waiting to give, I trusted him enough to believe it could wait another few minutes. The officiant looked at both of us before speaking the words every couple longs to hear. By the authority entrusted to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. A wave of warm applause filled the chapel. Daniel leaned forward and kissed me softly. The kiss wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was gentle, patient, and deeply familiar, exactly like the man himself. The room erupted into louder applause, and for one beautiful moment, I forgot about everything else. I forgot the empty seats. I forgot the cameras. I forgot my family's rejection. I was simply a wife. When we turned to face our guests together, flashes from professional cameras briefly illuminated the chapel. The photographers documenting the wedding blended almost seamlessly with the television crew standing farther back. Friends smiled, some wiping away tears, while others laughed with genuine happiness. I saw Emma clap harder than anyone else. Michael whistled loudly enough to make everyone laugh. Their joy reminded me that, although my family had chosen absence, I wasn't completely alone. After greeting several guests, Daniel quietly excused himself for a few moments. "I'll be right back," he whispered. Before I could ask where he was going, one of the television producers approached him near the entrance. They exchanged a few words before Daniel nodded and disappeared into a nearby room. I remained with our guests, accepting hugs and congratulations while trying to ignore the growing curiosity inside me. Several people noticed the television equipment as well. One of my coworkers leaned closer. "Did you know this was happening?" I smiled awkwardly. "I know as much as you do." She laughed, assuming I was joking. I wasn't. A few minutes later, Daniel returned. He looked exactly as calm as he always did. Nothing in his expression suggested the extraordinary attention surrounding him. The producer quietly walked toward the front of the chapel and politely addressed the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Before today's celebration concludes, We'd like to make a brief announcement with the permission of the bride and groom. Every conversation immediately stopped. Even I looked toward Daniel in surprise. He simply reached for my hand. The producer smiled warmly. Today's ceremony has been recorded as part of a nationally televised feature highlighting one of the country's most respected business leaders. I frowned. Business leader? For a split second, I wondered whether one of the wedding guests had secretly become famous without telling anyone. Then the producer continued. Mr. Daniel Whitmore has spent many years avoiding public attention, despite leading one of America's fastest-growing technology companies. The chapel became completely silent. I slowly turned toward my husband. He offered me a small, apologetic smile. The producer continued speaking. Today, with Mr. Whitmore's permission, the public will finally meet the woman he has chosen to share his life with. My heart skipped. Daniel Whitmore. The name suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not because I hadn't heard it countless times before, because I had never heard anyone speak it with such significance. The producer stepped aside as a large portable monitor positioned near the back of the chapel came to life. A professionally edited introduction began playing. Images of corporate headquarters, international conferences, technology campuses, charitable foundations, major construction projects, financial headlines. Then Daniel appeared on the screen, not wearing the simple suit of the man I knew, but standing confidently before hundreds of shareholders at what looked like a global conference. The narrator's voice echoed gently through the chapel. Daniel Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies. My breathing slowed. A global technology company, currently valued at more than $5 billion. Someone behind me gasped loudly. Another guest whispered, "5 billion?" I stared at the screen. The words didn't make sense. $5 billion? No, that couldn't be possible. Daniel had never lied to me, but he had never said this either. The presentation continued. Photographs showed him meeting government officials, speaking at international innovation summits, receiving humanitarian awards, and opening educational programs across the country. It looked like someone else's life. Not the man who made me tea after difficult work days. Not the man who insisted on carrying grocery bags because he knew my shoulders hurt after long hours drafting blueprints. Not the man who patiently listened whenever I questioned my own worth. The room remained frozen. I looked at Daniel again. You. I couldn't finish the sentence. He nodded gently. I wanted you to know, because of me. His voice remained calm. Not because of headlines. Tears unexpectedly filled my eyes again. You never told me. I wanted to be certain that if you loved me, he smiled softly. You loved only me. I laughed through my tears. You idiot. The words escaped before I could stop them. You honestly thought I cared about your money? His smile widened for the first time all day. No. I just never wanted it to become part of the reason. I shook my head in disbelief. The guests surrounding us slowly began applauding again. Not the kind of applause reserved for wealth. Something warmer, more genuine. Emma walked toward me and wrapped me in the tightest hug she had ever given. I knew he adored you, she whispered. I just didn't realize the rest. Neither had I. The television feature ended with a final image of Daniel standing beside me only moments earlier. The narrator concluded with one sentence. Today, one of the nation's most private business leaders begins the most important partnership of his life. The screen faded to black. Almost immediately, phones throughout the chapel began vibrating. One guest looked down before widening his eyes. Another opened a news website. Someone else quietly laughed in disbelief. It already broke. What? The story. He turned his phone toward us. National news outlets had already begun publishing photographs from the ceremony. Headlines spread faster than I could read them. Private billionaire CEO marries Seattle architect. Daniel Whitmore introduces wife during exclusive ceremony. The mystery behind America's most private executive ends today. Everything was happening too quickly. The television crew packed equipment with remarkable efficiency, while reporters outside the chapel prepared for live broadcasts. I felt as though the world had shifted beneath my feet in a matter of minutes. Daniel slipped his arm gently around my shoulders. I'm sorry I surprised you. I looked up at him. Are you? He laughed quietly. Maybe a little. I rested my forehead briefly against his shoulder. So, my husband is one of the richest men in the country. I suppose that's technically true. And you thought that wasn't worth mentioning? I was hoping you'd stay for my personality. Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes only after overwhelming emotions finally find somewhere safe to land. I had entered the chapel, believing the greatest story of that day would always be my family's rejection. Instead, life had quietly rewritten everything. But, while I was still trying to understand the truth standing beside me, hundreds of miles away another television had just switched on. And in the Carter family living room, 3 people who had proudly skipped my wedding were about to discover exactly whose ceremony they had refused to attend. While I was still trying to absorb everything Daniel had revealed, the outside world was moving much faster than either of us. News traveled in seconds, and before we had even finished greeting our guests, the story had already spread across television stations, financial websites, and social media. I hadn't seen any of it yet. At that moment, I was simply trying to understand that the quiet man I loved had trusted me enough to let me know him before he allowed the world to know us. We stayed at the chapel longer than we had planned. Friends surrounded us with congratulations, though many of them looked at Daniel with entirely new expressions. A few asked cautious questions about the television announcement, but Daniel answered each one with the same humility that had first drawn me to him. I've always preferred a private life, he explained more than once. Today wasn't about business, it was about my wife. Every time he said the word wife, I couldn't help smiling. Eventually the crowd began to thin. Guests hugged us goodbye, promising to call soon, and our photographer captured a few final portraits outside the chapel beneath the afternoon sun. The television crew had already packed most of their equipment, leaving only a small production team finishing interviews with organizers. For a brief moment, everything felt almost normal again. Then my phone vibrated. Once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. I glanced down at the screen. 34 unread notifications. Most came from coworkers and former classmates offering congratulations. Then I noticed a name I hadn't expected. Dad. Another notification appeared before I could even open the first one. Mom. A third. Dad again. Then another from Mom. Within seconds, the screen filled faster than I could read. Calls. Text messages. Voicemails. The same 2 names repeated over and over. Daniel noticed my expression. What is it? I turned the phone toward him. I think they've seen the news. He looked at the screen for only a moment before quietly nodding. They probably have. I opened my father's first message. Evelyn, call me immediately. The second arrived less than 2 minutes later. Where are you? Then another. We need to talk. There was no mention of the wedding. No congratulations. No apology for refusing to come. Nothing about whether I was happy. Only urgency. Only demands. My mother's messages followed. Evelyn, why didn't you tell us? Another appeared before I finished reading. How long have you known? Then another. People are calling us. The words blurred together. Not once did she ask whether the ceremony had gone well. Not once did she ask whether I was all right after spending the day without my family. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like if my parents finally wanted to talk to me. I thought I would feel relieved. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Daniel remained silent, allowing me to process everything at my own pace. Do you want to answer? He asked gently. I looked back at the screen. My father's name flashed again. Incoming call. I declined it. Seconds later, my mother's number appeared. I declined that one too. Another message arrived almost immediately. This is important. I couldn't help noticing the irony. My graduation had apparently not been important. My National Architecture Award hadn't been important. My engagement hadn't been important. But now it was urgent. I unlocked the family group chat. For months it had been almost completely silent. Birthdays passed with brief messages. Holidays came and went with polite greetings. Nothing more. Now the conversation exploded faster than I could follow. Dad, Evelyn, answer your phone. Mom, why didn't you tell us Daniel was Daniel Whitmore? Dad, this affects the entire family. Mom, reporters are calling. Dad, we need to discuss this privately. I stared at the words for a long time. Something inside me waited for anger to arrive. It never did. Instead, I remembered sitting alone after my architecture awards ceremony, holding a trophy while waiting for a phone call that never came. I remembered mailing invitations that disappeared without acknowledgement. I remembered wondering whether I mattered enough for anyone to notice. Now they noticed. Not because I had changed. Because the world had changed the way they looked at me. That realization removed the last trace of guilt I had been carrying. I wasn't punishing them. I simply wasn't rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could explain everything. I could remind them they had refused to meet Daniel. I could ask why wealth suddenly mattered more than character. I could finally tell them how deeply they had hurt me. None of it would change what had already happened. Slowly, I closed the keyboard. Instead of typing, I pressed and held my father's message. A row of reactions appeared. Without overthinking it, I tapped the laughing reaction. One small ha-ha. Nothing else. I repeated the same reaction beneath my mother's question. Then I locked my phone. Daniel watched quietly. That's all? I nodded. I've spent my whole life explaining myself. I slipped the phone into my purse. I'm tired. He smiled softly. I understand. On the drive home, neither of us spoke very much. The city looked exactly as it always had. Cars filled the streets. People hurried along sidewalks. Restaurants buzzed with evening conversations. Somewhere among those thousands of ordinary lives, ours had become front-page news. It still didn't feel real. When we finally reached our apartment, Daniel disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned, carrying 2 champagne glasses. I know this isn't exactly how either of us imagined today ending. He handed me one. But I think surviving your wedding deserves a toast. I laughed. Surviving? He raised an eyebrow. I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He smiled. Today was much more stressful. We clinked our glasses together. For the first time since waking that morning, I allowed myself to breathe without expecting another disappointment. The silence inside the apartment felt peaceful, not empty. Peaceful. My phone buzzed again across the coffee table. Then again. Then again. Neither of us reached for it. Instead, Daniel sat beside me. You know, he said quietly, there's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. I looked at him. When people suddenly discover money, they often believe the person has changed. He shook his head. But money doesn't change character. It reveals everyone else's. I thought about my parents. Only hours earlier, they had considered my marriage a disgrace. Now they wanted immediate access to the son-in-law they had refused to meet. Nothing about Daniel had changed. Nothing about me had changed. Only one piece of information had become public. Yet somehow that single fact had transformed their entire attitude. The phone continued vibrating. This time I picked it up, not to answer, simply to silence it. As I looked at the endless list of missed calls, another thought quietly settled into my heart. For years I had waited beside the phone, hoping my parents might finally choose me. Now they were the ones waiting. I set the device face down on the table. Then, without hesitation, I opened my contacts. Robert Carter. I looked at the name for several seconds. Then, I deleted it. Margaret Carter. Delete. Sophia Carter. Delete. The room remained completely still. No dramatic music. No overwhelming rush of emotion. Just a quiet sense of relief unlike anything I had ever experienced. Daniel reached over and gently intertwined his fingers with mine. You okay? I looked around our small apartment, at the man sitting beside me, at the peaceful evening stretching ahead of us. For the first time in my life, I answered without pretending. Yeah. I smiled. I think I finally am. Just as the words left my mouth, my phone lit up one more time with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Something told me not to. When I answered, the familiar voice on the other end spoke without even saying hello. "Evelyn," my father said, "you're coming home tomorrow. We need to have a serious conversation." He didn't ask. He ordered. And somehow, after everything that had happened that day, those words no longer frightened me at all. After my father ended the call without waiting for an answer, I stared at the dark screen for several seconds before placing the phone back on the table. The old version of me would have spent the rest of the night worrying about what he wanted to say, rehearsing explanations and searching for ways to avoid another argument. This time was different. Whatever conversation waited for me the following evening, I wasn't walking into that house, hoping to earn anyone's approval. I was going because I finally had nothing left to prove. The next day passed surprisingly quietly. I answered a few congratulatory emails from coworkers, ignored dozens of interview requests, forwarded by Daniel's public relations team, and tried to focus on ordinary things. I watered the plants on our balcony. I folded laundry. I organized a stack of architectural sketches that had been sitting on my desk for weeks. The routine helped steady my thoughts. Daniel watched me from the kitchen while making coffee. "You don't have to go." I looked up. "I know. You could tell them no." I could. He carried 2 mugs to the table before sitting across from me. "So why are you going?" I considered the question carefully. "Because if I don't, a part of me will always wonder whether I should have." He nodded slowly. "I'll respect whatever you decide." His confidence comforted me more than advice ever could. Late that afternoon, I drove alone to the house where I had spent most of my childhood. Everything looked exactly the same. The flower beds my mother obsessively maintained, the polished brass numbers beside the front door, the perfectly trimmed hedges my father insisted reflected discipline. For years, that house had represented everything I believed a family should be. Now it simply looked like a beautiful building filled with painful memories. Before I reached the front steps, the door opened. My mother was already waiting. For a brief moment, I thought she might hug me. Instead, she forced an uneasy smile. "Evelyn, come in." Her voice sounded unfamiliar. Not warmer, more cautious, as though she wasn't quite sure how to speak to me anymore. My father stood in the living room with his arms folded. Sophia sat quietly on the sofa, her phone resting untouched beside her. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt heavier than any shouting match I had ever experienced. Finally, my father gestured toward a chair. "Sit." I remained standing for another moment, before calmly taking a seat across from him. No one offered coffee. No one asked about the wedding. My father cleared his throat. "Why didn't you tell us?" There it was. The question they had apparently spent an entire day preparing. I looked at him steadily. "Tell you what?" He frowned. "Don't play games." "Daniel." His voice sharpened. "You knew exactly who he was." "I knew who he was. But not in the way you're implying." My mother leaned forward. "Evelyn, surely you understand why we're upset." I waited. "You let us find out from television." I couldn't stop the small smile that crossed my face. "That's what you're upset about?" My father answered immediately. "Of course." I tilted my head slightly. "I thought you were upset because you missed your daughter's wedding." Neither of them replied. The silence answered for them. My father shifted uncomfortably before speaking again. "That's not what this is about." "I know." I nodded. "I figured that out yesterday." He took a slow breath, visibly trying to regain control of the conversation. "If we had known Daniel was the CEO of Whitmore Technologies..." I quietly interrupted him. "Would you have come?" Another silence. Longer this time. My mother looked down at her hands. My father avoided my eyes. Finally he answered. "Things would have been different." I couldn't help noticing that he still hadn't said yes. He hadn't said they would have attended because they loved me, only because circumstances would have changed. I leaned back calmly. "I believe you." Sophia spoke for the first time. "You could have told us." Her voice lacked the confidence I remembered from childhood. "You knew people would find out eventually." I turned toward her. "Did you ever ask?" She blinked. "What? Did you ever ask me anything about Daniel?" She opened her mouth before slowly closing it again. I continued gently. Did you ask what he did for work? No. Did you ask whether he made me happy? No. Did you ask whether he treated me well? Again, she remained silent. I looked back toward my parents. Did either of you? Neither answered. I wasn't angry anymore, only strangely calm. I didn't hide my life from any of you. I folded my hands together. You simply never cared enough to learn about it. My father shook his head. That's unfair. Is it? I reached into my handbag and removed a worn manila folder. I had almost left it at home. Now I was glad I hadn't. I placed the first document on the coffee table, my architecture award certificate. You remember this? No one spoke. I invited all of you to the ceremony. I placed a second item beside it. A graduation program. My university commencement. Then another. A newspaper article featuring one of my community projects. I mailed this to the house. Finally, I laid down a faded engagement announcement. I even invited you to celebrate this. The table slowly filled with years of forgotten milestones. I didn't bring these to make you feel guilty. I looked directly at my father. I brought them because I wanted you to see something. He glanced down at the papers without touching them. I kept reaching toward you. I paused. You just never reached back. My mother's eyes slowly filled with tears. Evain. Her voice trembled. We were busy. I smiled sadly. I know. You always were. She wiped at her eyes. Your sister needed us. I nodded. I know. You've been saying that my whole life. She looked genuinely distressed. We tried our best. No. I answered quietly. You tried your best for Sophia. The words weren't spoken with bitterness. Only honesty. My father suddenly leaned forward. We sacrificed everything for this family. I don't doubt that. I met his chaza. But somewhere along the way, I gestured toward the documents between us. And you forgot I was part of it. His expression hardened. We wanted you to succeed. I did succeed. The room became completely still. I built a career I love. I married a man who respects me. I created a life I'm proud of. I smiled gently. The sad part is, I looked around the familiar living room. None of you noticed, until television cameras did. No one argued. Because no one could. Sophia quietly picked up the newspaper article from the table. I never knew you designed this. She stared at the photograph. My friend's family uses this community center. I nodded. I'm glad they like it. She looked up slowly. Why didn't you tell me? I almost laughed. I tried. Her shoulders sank. For the first time in my life, I saw something unfamiliar in my younger sister's eyes. Not superiority. Regret. My mother finally began crying openly. I thought there would always be time to fix things. I looked at her with compassion, but not with hope. I used to think that too. My father remained silent. The confident man who had spent decades making decisions for everyone else suddenly seemed unable to find the right words. Perhaps there weren't any. After several long moments, I gathered the documents back into the folder. I didn't come here for an apology. I stood slowly. I came because Dad said we needed to have a serious conversation. I looked at each of them. We've had it. No one stopped me as I turned toward the front door. Halfway across the room, my father's voice quietly broke the silence. Evan. I paused, but didn't turn around. I really didn't know. For years, those words would have meant everything to me. Now, they simply sounded late. I know, I answered softly. That's what hurts the most. Then I reached for the doorknob, leaving behind a room filled not with anger or accusations, but with something far heavier. The undeniable weight of everything they had failed to see until it was already too late. I stepped out of the house without looking back until I reached the end of the walkway. The evening air felt cooler than when I had arrived, carrying the familiar scent of freshly cut grass from the neighboring yards. Behind me, the front door remained open for a few seconds before quietly closing. No one called my name again. No one came running after me. For the first time in my life, leaving that house didn't feel like running away. It felt like walking toward the life I had already chosen. Daniel was waiting exactly where I knew he would be. He leaned casually against the car, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. The moment he saw me, he searched my face, not looking for victory or defeat, but simply trying to understand how I was feeling. "How did it go?" he asked softly after I reached him. I let out a slow breath. "It ended the way it probably should have years ago." He nodded without asking for details. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He understood that silence sometimes carried more truth than words. He opened the passenger door for me, and we began the drive home, just as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Streetlights flickered to life, one after another, illuminating roads I had traveled hundreds of times before. Yet somehow they looked different now. Not because the city had changed. Because I had. For most of my life, I believed healing meant receiving the apology I deserved. I imagined my father admitting he had been wrong. I imagined my mother finally recognizing how deeply her choices had hurt me. I imagined my sister seeing me as more than someone standing in the background of her achievements. Those dreams had quietly followed me into adulthood. Sitting beside Daniel that evening, I realized I no longer needed them. An apology would have been welcome. It simply wasn't necessary anymore. When we reached home, I changed into comfortable clothes while Daniel prepared dinner. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, fresh bread, and a simple salad. The ordinary rhythm of our evening grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. As we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he finally asked the question that mattered most. "Do you regret going?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No." "Why?" "Because I stopped wondering." He listened. For years, I kept telling myself there had to be a reason. A reason they forgot. A reason they didn't come. A reason they always chose someone else. I smiled faintly. Today I realized there wasn't some hidden explanation waiting for me. They simply made different choices. Saying the words aloud no longer felt painful, only honest. Daniel reached across the table and gently took my hand. "I'm sorry you had to learn that." "So am I." I looked down at our hands, but I'm glad I finally did. That night, after dinner, I walked into the small room we had turned into my home office. Architectural sketches covered one wall. Scale models sat neatly arranged across shelves. Awards I had once hidden in drawers now rested openly in plain view. I slowly walked past each one. Not because I needed to remind myself of what I had achieved. Because I finally understood something I had missed for years. Every project represented a chapter of my life that I had built without waiting for permission. No one had handed me those opportunities. No one had opened those doors. Every late night, every difficult client, every competition, every rejection, every success, they belonged to me. Not because someone finally approved of me, because I had refused to quit. I stopped in front of one framed photograph, showing the opening day of the community center I had designed years earlier. Children filled the courtyard, laughing while parents talked beneath shaded walkways. I smiled. Those families would never know my name. They didn't need to. The building itself was enough. For the first time, I appreciated my own work without imagining how my parents might have reacted to it. That quiet shift inside me felt more valuable than any public recognition. Over the following weeks, life gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The media attention faded exactly as Daniel had predicted. A few interviews aired. Several magazines published wedding photographs. Then the world moved on to newer stories. I was grateful. I had never wanted fame. I had only wanted peace. Occasionally, mutual friends mentioned hearing about my parents. Apparently, my father had declined several requests to comment publicly. My mother withdrew from a number of social events for a while. People speculated. People gossiped. I didn't. Whatever consequences they experienced belonged to choices they had made long before television cameras ever arrived at my wedding. One afternoon, months later, I received a handwritten envelope in the mail. There was no return address. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. For several minutes, I simply held the envelope without opening it. Daniel noticed. "You don't have to read it." "I know." I carried it into my office and placed it inside a desk drawer, still unopened. Not because I hated her, Not because I wanted revenge. Because I finally understood something that had taken me 32 years to learn. Closure isn't always found inside another person's explanation. Sometimes it's found in realizing you no longer need one. Whether that letter contained an apology, excuses, or regrets would not change the life I had already begun living. Weeks turned into months. My architecture firm continued growing. Daniel and I settled into the comfortable routines of married life. Weekend farmers markets, long evening walks, movie nights at home, quiet breakfasts before work. The extraordinary circumstances surrounding our wedding slowly became nothing more than another memory. One Sunday morning, while we were drinking coffee on the balcony, Daniel looked at me thoughtfully. "You smile more now." I laughed. "Do I?" He nodded. "It's different." "How?" "You don't look like you're waiting anymore." His words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. He was right. For years, I had waited. Waited for phone calls. Waited for invitations. Waited for birthdays that mattered. Waited for approval. Waited for someone else to decide I was finally enough. Without realizing it, I had built my entire emotional life around waiting. Now that waiting was over. Not because my parents had changed. Because I had. Sometimes people ask whether I ever forgave my family. The truth is more complicated than a simple yes or no. I stopped carrying anger. I stopped replaying old conversations. I stopped wishing the past had been different. Whether that's forgiveness or simply acceptance, I'm not sure. What I do know is this: their choices no longer determined my happiness. That freedom changed everything. If I could speak to the frightened little girl who stood at the edge of every birthday party wondering why no one noticed her, I wouldn't promise that one day everyone would finally see her. Because that isn't what happened. Instead, I would tell her something far more important. The people who overlook your worth do not define it. The people who compare you cannot measure you. And the people who fail to choose you are not the ones who decide whether you deserve love. Looking back now, I realized the greatest moment of my wedding wasn't the television announcement. It wasn't discovering Daniel's public identity. It wasn't the flood of messages from people who had suddenly become interested in my life. The greatest moment happened quietly, before any of that. It happened the instant I chose to walk down the aisle despite the empty seats waiting behind me. That was the moment my future truly began. Everything else was simply the world catching up to a decision I had already made. Sometimes people believe revenge is about making those who hurt you suffer. I don't believe that anymore. The sweetest victory isn't watching someone regret losing you. It's reaching the point where their regret no longer has the power to change your peace. On the day my parents refused to attend my wedding, they believed they were rejecting my future. They were wrong. They were only removing themselves from it. And as Daniel reached for my hand once again, while the morning sun filled our balcony with light, I understood something with complete certainty. I had never needed the perfect family I spent my childhood chasing. I only needed the courage to stop waiting for them and begin choosing myself. Looking back, I no longer see my wedding as the day my family abandoned me. I see it as the day I finally stopped abandoning myself. My parents lost far more than a successful son-in-law. They lost the daughter who had spent her entire life hoping they would one day choose her. Their regret came too late, but it taught me something priceless. The people who fail to recognize your worth cannot take it away from you. Real happiness begins the moment you stop chasing someone else's approval and start living with dignity, self-respect, and gratitude for those who truly stand beside you. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't becoming the wife of a billionaire. It was finally becoming the woman who knew she was enough,